From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities, presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. The topic, energy policy, a new war between the states. Now, here is Peter Hackus.
Many experts say that energy policy is the most crucial regional issue now facing this country. The nation has become divided, they say, between consumer and producer interests. The consuming states are blaming producing states for holding back on the production of oil and gas. The producing states, on the other hand, say that consumers just don't understand that energy production costs have risen tremendously. In some New England states, the situation has now become critical. Industrial plants have begun to cut back. Some plants are moving away. Unemployment is rising. Energy-producing states have argued that unless oil and gas prices are allowed to rise, exploration for new sources will decline, and this country will be even more dependent on foreign sources of energy. Some of the states along both the east and the west coasts have been resisting development of their offshore resources, while some inland states remain unable to obtain enough energy for their needs. Welcome to another roundtable discussion presented by the American Enterprise Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education organization. Today, 4 energy experts will deal with the topic, energy policy. Will it produce a new war between the states? Appearing on our panel today are David Boren, Governor of Oklahoma, lawyer and Rhodes Scholar. Mr. Boren also served 4 terms in the Oklahoma State Legislature. Edward Brooke, U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, former Attorney General of that state. Frank Zarb, head of the Federal Energy Administration, Executive Director of the Energy Resources Council, and Chief Presidential Energy Advisor. Stewart Udall, Board Chairman of Overview, an environmental consulting firm. Mr. Udall was Interior Secretary in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He is the author of a recent book, The Energy Balloon. Moderating will be Melvin Laird, Chairman of AEI's National Energy Project. Mr. Laird is a former congressman, former defense secretary, former counselor to the President of the United States. He is now senior counselor for national and international affairs at the Reader's Digest magazine. Now, here's Mr. Laird.
Thank you very much, Peter. During the past 2 days, we have had a very important energy conference here in Washington to discuss regional versus national interests in resolving the energy problems of the United States. In our panel discussion today, we want to discuss some of the problems that confront the states in what some people have entitled the war between the states as far as energy is concerned. Senator Brooke, in the discussions in the Congress, Massachusetts and some of the New England states have been criticized from time to time by representatives of Texas and Louisiana for their failure to take the risks that face certain environmental risks in developing energy sources themselves in the New England areas, particularly offshore and in refinery capacity and other energy areas. What's your comment?
Well, now that's the old battle of the producer states versus the consumer states. It has raged for a long period of time, and of course, during the Industrial Revolution, everybody suffered. We've had our problems as well as the producer states have had their problems, and at that time, we weren't so conscious of Earth, we weren't so conscious of the environment, and today we are, and I think we are all to blame, and I think we ought to not be so much concerned with the past, but we ought to be concerned with the future, and we're ready to take our risk as well. We may have to take our risk in Massachusetts. We very well may have a great resource of coal in southeastern Massachusetts. We may have some oil, some gas on the outer continental shelf. We want to develop those resources, but we want not to make the mistakes that have been made in states like Louisiana and Texas and in the Gulf of Mexico. We want environmental protection, and we want to do it with environmental protection. And we did have a refinery. We had a refinery in Everett, Massachusetts, And that refinery, as I recall, was closed down by the major oil company. And then we tried to get a refinery in Machiasport. You remember that, Stu, very well. What happened? Well, the producers and the refiners came up, testified against it. Stu, I think it was your administration which really killed it, as a matter of fact. And we would have been very happy to have had it in New England. No, we want to develop the deep water ports. We want a refinery, and we'll do it so long as we can be sure that our environment will be protected. And we're also willing to compensate those states that have suffered the Gulf of Mexico areas in the Coastal Zone Act, for example. I think co-sponsored and supported an amendment which would compensate them for the past, the recent past injuries, and for the future.
Secretary Udall, I'm sorry that you killed that development in New England.
Well, that's not quite fair.
I had some help.
You were in charge of administering a very important program while you were Secretary of Interior, both in the Kennedy administration and in the Johnson administration, at the mandatory oil import program. We, in our discussions yesterday, heard some criticisms of the mandatory oil import program as to what it was intended to do, what it actually did, and also whether or not it really accomplished what it was intended to accomplish. What's your comment as the person charged with the responsibility of administering that program during a very important period?
Well, Mel, we did have, as far as oil is concerned, a worldwide free market situation until 1957. The Arab-Israeli war at that time produced, and the closing of the Suez Canal produced a crisis, and out of that came the oil import program, which for the first time began to pit consumer states against producer states in the United States. And I administered it for 8 years. It ran from President Eisenhower's administration until 1973. And I always had mixed feelings about it because as a program, what it meant was that New England, as Senator Brooke well knows, was paying through the nose to protect the producer states. I think they paid about something in the neighborhood of $500 million a year extra because they couldn't get the cheap oil coming in from the Middle East. We put a lid on the imports into the United States. But yet, even though it seemed to me at the time this was unfair, when the Arab embargo came 2 years ago, I could see that if we had not had an oil import program, if we hadn't limited the penetration into the United States, instead of being dependent for 36% of our oil, we might have been importing 75% of our oil. And the oil industry in the producing states might have been in such a predicament that they could not provide what the country needed. So these are very complicated problems, and I think if I may make one point, I think one great lesson I learned in the 8 years I was in the government is that it'll be a great mistake if we ever balkanize, get regional feelings that are so intense in this country that we can't have a national energy policy. Our country, its great strength is the fact that we do use our resources in a rational way to benefit the whole country. And where energy is concerned, we're connected with pipelines, and the pipelines carry oil and natural gas. And that is the strength of the United States, and this conflict between producer and consumer states can be a very destructive and damaging thing to the country if we don't bring it under control.
Governor Boren, wasn't too many years ago that we used to hear the oil producers in the United States saying, well, you give us $5 a barrel for oil and the problems are all over. Now, we've gone beyond the $5 a barrel for oil and the problems aren't over. As the governor of the great state of Oklahoma, what's your answer to that?
Well, I think one of the answers is that where we're finding oil and the production costs have increased tremendously. What we have to do, and I think agree very much with what has been said, this whole distinction between producing and consuming states is one I think we ought to quit drawing. And in fact, Oklahoma in a very short time will be an importer of energy. We will be a consuming state pretty quickly. Our interests are seeing more domestic sources of energy of all kinds developed. This is a national matter. But I think we have to think about what's going to happen in this country in the next 3 to 4 years. That's the key thing right now. We talk about development of nuclear power, solar power, offshore exploration. All of these things are going to take time. They take lead time. Capital investment has to be made. Environmental impact studies have to be made. The true costs, environmentally and otherwise, have to be added in. What can we do in the short run to solve the problem in this country in the next 3 to 4 years to hold our economy together while we make these long-term decisions? And I think that the answer in the short term has to come from two sources of energy that are readily available. Oil. We have a pipeline network. As soon as a well is drilled, domestically that oil can get into a pipeline and get where it's needed. Natural gas. A well, when it's completed, the very day it's completed, it can be put online and into a pipeline, and gas can flow into areas like Massachusetts or North Carolina to keep the factories open the winter and to keep unemployment down. And the only way you can get oil and gas developed in the short run is to have a price that is adequate. I heard one governor explain this recently by saying, if we had candy bars regulated in this country at $2 or 2 cents a bar, and the cost of producing a candy bar was 8 or 9 cents, we'd have a candy bar shortage in this country. And that's putting it very simply, but it's true. And as long as you regulate the price of oil and gas below what it costs to produce it, we're not going to have it. So I think that we have to have a reasonable price structure, but I think we can reach national agreement on this. And the governors, for example, 30 governors have endorsed a compromise plan.
I think you've done very well to get 30 governors to agree on any plan.
Well, it shows that it can be done, and there were only 3 from producing states. 27 were from consuming states, some of them from New England. And what we tried to do was agree on a 5-year suspension on natural gas regulation. And what this will do, it will allow new natural gas to be explored at a market price that will make that exploration possible. The deep wells, some of these cost $5 to $10 million. And at the same time, by limiting it to a 5-year period, we protect the consumer in New England, for example, against a rapid increase in prices. So these kinds of solutions can be found. And people in our part of the country, the so-called producing region, we know that there have to be problems eased. There are special problems, let's say, with propane users, home fuel oil in Massachusetts, for example. We want to do our part. There are trade-offs that have to be made. And I think as long as people are of goodwill, they can be made.
Mel, if I may ask the governor just a question. I agree with what you've said, with the exception that can't we have an equivalent cost for oil and gas?
I think that, Senator, we have to have an equivalent price for all sources of energy ultimately. In other words, they're all precious resources. We know that any form of energy is precious. And for example, if natural gas is really worth $2 right now compared with oil, and we let natural gas be priced at 20 cents under some contracts, what do we encourage? We encourage people to think that natural gas is cheap and to use it very wastefully. We're wasting a precious natural resource through the pricing structure. I agree with that, but now I think that the difference of opinion I have, for example, with the Stevenson bill and some other things that have come up is this. They want to take an average price of natural gas, for example, and say it ought to be $1.30 compared to the price they want to have for oil. Now this is fine as an average, but it's not good as a price for new natural gas, because to find new natural gas it costs so much more, below $15,000 or $20,000.
That's not an arbitrary figure now. The Joint Economic Committee, Paul McElroy, they have models that show that $1.30 and I think $9 for a barrel of oil are generous, that they will allow, they will permit an incentive for production. We want to do that. And what we'd like to see simply is an equivalent price with a ceiling that would encourage production.
Well, the ceiling, the problem with that is the ceiling you set will not encourage production. Let me explain it this way. We did a study of a utility company, a nationally known CPA firm. My Energy Council commissioned it, which, by the way, is not an industry group, but a very impartial group that has consumer representatives on it. The study showed that the residential unit user in New York was paying $2.60 per unit for natural gas. Out of that $2.60, do you know what the amount paid to the Oklahoma producer was? 25 cents. The rest of it was pipeline cost, 60 cents, and distribution cost in New York, $1.75. Now, if you're talking about raising the average price of natural gas from 25 cents to $1.30, well, of course, I would not be opposed to raising the average. I don't think you have to raise the average price of natural gas that high to get results. The average could go up to maybe 50 or 60 cents because the old contracts would still be held control. But here's the key. To get new gas, for example, in Oklahoma, where's the new gas that you need to fill those pipelines with? It's below 15,000 feet. Now, those shallow wells don't cost so much to drill, but below 15,000 feet and down to 20 and 30,000 feet, it may be costing $2 to get that new gas. So if you peg it at $1.30, you don't get any new gas. It's very generous on the old gas as an average, you see. We have to draw a distinction about the price per unit of the new gas we're going after now. It's more expensive, and what would be a fair average price for natural gas.
Well, I think these models indicate that it would be fair.
What's your comment on that, Frank? Frank Zarb, our expert from the federal government, the so-called Zarb the Czar.
I think both the senator and the governor are saying the same thing in basic fundamental philosophy, but when it comes to the hard chore of putting numbers on the ground, they're not very close together. The governor is saying that to replace this 25 cent per unit gas oftentimes is going to cost $1.75 at the wellhead or $1 at the wellhead. And as a result, we ought to provide a freedom so that that exploration can take place. When the senator talks about equalizing gas and oil, he's referring to a notion that is now being studied in the Senate. And while the notion has some merit, the numbers are set at a point currently where, in our judgment, would not provoke the desired action and reaction, and that is to produce more American supplies of gas and oil. So long as the numbers are set correctly, that equilibrium formula certainly could do the job, or any other formula of that kind can do the job. But the big debate is going to take place at where we set the numbers and whether or not we let those costs escalate over a period of time to reflect increased costs due to inflation and other reasons. It really gets down to the bottom line. If people are willing to pay for more American oil and gas to have an assurance of supply and not pay outrageous prices to foreigners to get the same job done, they're going to have to agree on the price. And that's where the debate has to take place, and hopefully it will result in legislation which is both realistic but not excessive.
Yesterday in our discussions, there were several comments made that there is a growing distrust that is developed not so much in the producing areas of the country, but a distrust for the oil industry in the United States. Now, as the chief energy officer of our government, what do you think about this growing distrust that shows up as far as the oil industry is concerned in the various polls and public opinion surveys in the United States?
Well, I'd say two or three things about that. First, I'd be the last to defend some of the actions of the industry in past years, or even some current practices. I think that they, like many of our other larger institutions, both in private and public life have a long way to go to earn back the respect of the American people, and I think it has to be earned. It's just not going to be talked back into existence. In creating the problem we currently have, the industry must take its share of the blame along with the rest of us. We all, as a nation, sold out to cheap oil, and while the import quotas were directed in the right direction, perhaps motivated incorrectly at the time, they really didn't get the job done. New England sold out the cheap oil along with the rest of us to a point where they now are dependent upon foreign sources for about 80% of everything they use up there. Now, finally, I'd say that the most unhappy fact from all of this is that too frequently a politician will use this set of circumstances, the suspicions of our big institutions, some of the past problems that have developed, and even some of the current practices, and use it as the devil's spirit theory as to why we have a problem, and imply to the American people that if we can only find a way to exercise that evil spirit, all of our problems will be solved. Well, that's really fraudulent. Those problems do exist. They should be corrected. They should be fixed. The industry should be examined along with all of our other institutions and be held accountable to the people. But don't try and convince the people that if so long as we can get at that evil spirit, that we'll find a big pool of oil or gas somewhere and everything will be well again. That's what's brought us to the unfortunate point we're at. And politicians who would play on that emotion are really doing a disservice to all of us.
Is there a real understanding of what the increases brought about by the international oil cartel, OPEC, mean to the consumer in the United States?
Well,
that doesn't show up in any of these public opinion surveys.
It's showing up more and more in the analysis that we're doing. People are becoming...
I noticed you spoke out rather strongly about the 10% increase. I hadn't heard you speak too strongly about the 500% increase.
Well, let me start now. I was particularly incensed at two things. First, we as a nation sat around the tickers for about 3 months waiting to see how much more OPEC was going to charge the American consumers, and the numbers were all over the lot. And finally, we learned that we're only going to have to pay $2 billion a year more. And some among us felt fairly good about that. My goodness, they said it could have been worse, which was a symptom of what we've gotten ourselves into. We have been increased not 500%, 700% before this latest increase. And I think that is, in itself, is an outrage. But our outrage should be directed as rigorously internally as it is externally. We as a nation have sat for 10 years with some people warning us, incidentally, a number of studies in and out of government warning us over the last 10 years that we were getting into deep trouble. And we have allowed this condition, these set of circumstances to exist that allow OPEC to generate these kinds of increases. And for the last year, with all the talk and argument that's raised, we haven't produced one solid piece of legislation to fix the situation. Now, I should think that we should be as angry both with respect to what OPEC does and its what I consider really irrational and unreasoned changes in price in the last 2 years, as well as our own inability to come to grips with the situation.
Well, I have the feeling that we're still living in a dream world in this country from an energy standpoint. And we have all this talk at the national level about energy independence, and month by month, week by week, we're becoming more dependent. And I don't think we're facing up to the realities. As Frank has just said, OPEC's power is undiminished. I think they're stronger today than they were before. We acted as though there was some way that we could upset their whole the cohesion that makes it possible. But we're digging ourselves in deeper in this country, I think, because of a failure to recognize that even if we gave the petroleum industry everything it asked for, I wish some of the oil men would admit this, if we gave them everything we've asked for, complete decontrol, they still can't maintain our reserves, and they can't maintain production. If we could get, and probably everybody here disagrees with me on this, but I can give you some recent figures if you want them. And I think until we recognize that our petroleum is probably, other than the topsoil in this country, the most precious resource we have, and that we're running out, and that there is no quick way, in fact, there's no way at all, that the oil industry, if they did their very best, can increase production in this country significantly, that we're just going to hold our own. Once we recognize that, then we would see that we're in deep, deep trouble, and that we're going to have to conserve and stretch and wisely use all the remaining oil and natural gas that we have. Now that's startling to say it, but that's where I come out. When I look at where we've been the last 15 years, when I've followed it closely.
Well, I think the key to that, Stu, is the word conserve. I mean, if we're ever going to be free of OPEC, or not as dependent upon OPEC, we've got to have a tough conservation policy. The country, just all due respect to you, Frank, we don't have a tough conservation policy. No one wants to conserve. I mean, take gasoline, which is the big waster. It's the guzzler. It's been, we still have the big cars. We still have the inefficient cars. We still have 3 or 4 cars to every family. From 1974 to 1975, when we were supposedly conserving, we increased our use of gasoline, by 3% from 74 to 75, which means, we're not cutting back. We have cut back, I think, certainly in our region, for example, and I think we're talking mostly on regions, but in our region we cut back considerably on home heating fuel. We cut back 20%. We cut back on industrial use of residual oil, 18%. But nobody in the nation, including us, cut back on gasoline. Now the country's going to have to conserve. We're going to have to bite the bullet. We need a tough policy. The gasoline tax. Nobody wants to talk about it. Some people believe it won't work, but a stiff gasoline tax. I mean, I came out with a 20 cents tax on gasoline. My God, you should have seen the mail. I'm glad I wasn't running at the time. I had to compromise it finally to get some support in the Senate to 15 cents. But we're going to have a tough conservation policy. That's not the whole part of it. I mean, we just can't do it with a gas tax, to be sure. There are other factors that have to be built in. We're going to have to start in the construction of building, conservation procedures and devices used in our construction policies. But I just want to see the government come down with a tough conservation policy. I think you've come down with a lot of policies, most of which I think have been wrong so far as New England is concerned. I mean, imports, for example, have hurt us. No question.
Import tax.
The import tax has hurt us. Any artificial barrier, I think, has hurt us. You're going all the way back to 1938 when you regulated, you control natural gas, for example. We suffered as consumers. We suffered. The producer states did well. It was supposed to help the consumer, and it hurt the producer. But it really didn't help us in New England because we couldn't get natural gas.
That's a good point. When you talk about decontrol, people tend to think, well, that's what the producer states want. Well, decontrol, we're doing fine under the present system. When we advocate decontrol, we're wanting decontrol so we can send gas to you and get it produced for you in Massachusetts.
Well, we certainly don't get it. We use hardly any natural gas for industrial purposes in New England. I mean, we suffer. That's how you states have grown, because we've had to use this high-cost oil for industry development in our states, and we've had to go overseas. We were getting cheap oil, and then of course you put your import quotas, and OPEC came in, so now we're paying more than anyone else for oil.
I agree, but when we talk about conservation, Secretary, and I agree with what's been said, we have to conserve. But on the other hand, for us to go out, and I think this is the problem that the American people have, to go out to the American people and say, all right, cut back drastically on your use of energy consumption. Don't drive cars anymore. Turn the thermostat down. And to have people, and I think the American people, if they could be convinced that they really had to do that, I think we're a tough people and we're willing to make hard sacrifices once we understand the costs. But now, I think people have trouble doing that, believing that. When, for example, I can tell you that in Oklahoma right now, if we had the right kinds of governmental policies, through going in and forcing water down into the ground, into our old oil wells, we could recover in a very short period of years, 5 or 6, 10 years, we could recover 5.2 billion barrels of oil in Oklahoma alone. Now think about that figure, 5.2 billion. Our present annual production of oil is 130 million. Just through that one mechanism. When we have $250 million worth of investment ready to go into drilling natural gas wells in western Oklahoma right now that's stopped because of uncertainty. After all, how can anyone invest in a well when they don't know what the price is going to be and they don't know if they're going to have a return on their investment? When we sit there with those kinds of reserves that we have that are available right now, I think it's very hard, and don't use them because of governmental policies that cause uncertainty. And I say this not in criticism of Mr. Zarb, because I think that the administration, and I say this as a Democrat about a Republican administration, I think they're trying. I think they're trying to bring some certainty. I think there's some people in the Congress, and while you and I may disagree on some details, I think you're trying to bring some certainty. But if we could have that certainty, and if the people could know that we're getting every available ounce of production now, I think then the people will be willing to make the other kinds of sacrifices. But I think we've got to be honest. And if we're going to have more energy in this country, we're going to have to invest dollars into exploring for new energy and developing, whether it's nuclear or solar, all the other things, including the very environmentally clean sources of energy. We're going to have to invest money in that. And that means the people are going to have to give up spending money on some other things to get it into energy production. I think if we tell people the truth, they'll be willing to conserve, they'll be willing to put the money into investment to get as much energy as we can, and then we'll be off high-centered.
But I still want to put this in perspective because I agree with what both of you have said. And Mel, I guess it was out of the conference that this organization held a year ago. I remember you came out for gas rationing, and I happened to be at that point where I thought
I also wrote an article in the January issue of the Reader's Digest. I work for Reader's Digest. I thought I'd throw that in.
All right. But, thank you
For
the commercial. But the only way that the United States, Frank, can send a message to OPEC that will be received is to go to some kind of rationing in this country. We all recognize it. We all talk about conservation. Governor, the only thing that I would like to have agreement on, if we could get it here, is that because the oil states and the oil state spokesmen and the people for the industry say, if you just rip off the lid and let us have these high prices, we will produce more and the crisis will be over because we'll increase production. And it's not going to happen. And I'd like to tell you in a minute about 1974, because it was a very interesting year, Frank, because the oil industry had everything it's asked for, everything it wanted, and they invested $4 billion more in 1974. Drilling increased, as we were told yesterday, 23% in 1974. But in terms, and the industry had a good year, but in terms of new discoveries, adding to our reserves, we used in 1974 3.5 billion barrels of oil. They found 2. We used 21 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, Governor, in 1974. The industry found 8. And our natural gas reserves have been going down since 1968. Our crude oil reserves have been going down since 1961. The whole picture is one of an industry that is past its peak and of a resource that is limited and non-renewable. And we're on the downside of the curve, but we're pretending there's some way we can raise production back up. And if I could get the country to agree on that one thing, that we passed the peak, then we would really get into conservation, because there's no way. I agree with you, we've got to have incentives. The prices are probably going to have to go up, and the consumer's going to have to pay whatever it'll take.
Stewart, I would
But-
amend that. I don't think
No.
we know that we've passed the peak. We may have passed the peak.
Well, I'm convinced that we have. All the evidence says that we have.
I would like to take a moment to talk about a few of the issues raised. Senator, in gasoline, I just want to correct the record from a standpoint of numbers. As a practical matter, we have, in the last 3 years, been fairly flat in gasoline consumption. Last year and this year were just about equal. Part of that's due to the economic recession, so I don't want to take all credit for energy conservation. And we have had some movement in this country toward, for example, the latest automobiles announced by even the American manufacturers who were used to, in the past, producing chromium-plated gunboats instead of cars. I think we really are beginning to make a breakthrough in that sector, as we are in some other sectors. And I think that came about because the price of gasoline has increased because of OPEX actions, and the consumer exercises his vote in the showroom. His first question is how many miles per gallon. So we're beginning to see some motion there. But let's talk for a moment about this glib phrase, conservation. Because I think we really have to examine what we mean by it and what we are going to need to affect it. The first question, which is the obvious one, does that mean that you price this scarce commodity at its real value to the economy and to the society? And we have to have that debate and settle it. Or are we going to keep it at some level below its real value? Because that's really inconsistent. You can't say that you're going to price it below its real value, whatever that value is. Its replacement value has one notion that ought to be examined, and hope to use it in the society for its true representation. The way we build our homes, the way we build our automobiles, the way we run our factories, is consistent with how we treat it. When we had gasoline at 19.9 per gallon and gave away 6 empty glasses with a tank fill, we ordered chromium-plated gunboats, and each year we had more chrome, more horsepower, and more gasoline was consumed. But with all due respect, Senator, in this area of conservation, I've really reached a point of mild irritation on that issue from a legislative standpoint. There are a couple of pieces of legislation sent to the Congress last January that I considered awfully important, that had no relationship to price. One was a very fundamental piece of legislation that had to do with how we build our buildings. The President asked the Congress for a standard housing code and construction code for all buildings throughout the nation. And it was a very simple piece of legislation so that any builder who wanted a mortgage from a bank that had a federal relationship had to have a certificate that said, I have followed this very narrow range of thermal standards. The architects were talked to by me, the construction builders were, and the labor unions were, and I thought we had a general understanding that this was the right direction to head in. That legislation's been up there now for 10 months, and I'm told that we're not going to get the bill, and we're not going to get the mandatory provisions of the bill. The political process is not yet ready to generate that kind of standard. Our authorities to mandate the conversion away from gas and oil to coal at the utility sector is very important, because one thing that David mentioned a moment ago is how we waste natural gas. And the most magnificent way to waste it is to burn it to generate electricity. And we're doing it all over the country.
How can we do it in New England, for example, and how can they do it in Boston with coal?
Let's stay away from New England just for a moment. The fact is that our authorities to mandate that conversion have been before the Congress. They expired in June, and the Congress is reluctant to renew those authorities. Now, here are two very important methods of forcing conservation or more effective use of our natural resources that the body politic is not yet ready to generate. I'm not suggesting that we can do it in New England. I'm talking now nationally. So that when we talk about conservation, we really have to put up what we're really talking about. The Congress did not go along with a gasoline tax. It was defeated by an enormous margin on the House side.
It wasn't popular, there's no question about it. And the same thing about, you say we're talking nationally, not only in New England, but you're not going to be able to burn coal in Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland, the major cities across the country, because the coal isn't clean. In the main instance, we've got environmental problems that we have to deal with and resolve. We're not able to do it. I think Congress has to work with it. I'm not being defensive for Congress at all, but you know, it's not that simple that you say, well, we mandate the use of coal for utility purposes. We'd like to use it, but we can't. We've got to get clean coal in areas like that in order to use it for utility purposes.
That simply is just not the total fact. Before our authorities expired in June, had issued orders to 25 utilities. Now, the law is there, and it provides for an Environmental Protection Agency veto mechanism if our analysis isn't correct. Now, we have a long way we can go further within that context to get the job done. In many of the areas you mentioned, we can't do it, but Chicago is moving forward with their nuclear power, so they're going to solve their problem a different way. The point I'm trying to make is that while we hear a lot from those who are concerned about our pricing policies, which I happen to consider to be responsible from a standpoint of using up our natural resources in this country, we hear about conservation as a national policy, and I keep asking those, tell me what is the body politic ready to pass and legislate which will mandate conservation? I've just given you the simplest of forms. The building standard surely is something that you and I could come into agreement with, but we're not going to get that in the form of legislation.
Frank, this brings us back. I think you have a legitimate complaint that Congress has been slow to act on conservation. But I think it's still part of this perception that there's some easy way out, that we don't have to make big, basic, structural, fundamental changes. We talked a moment about gas rationing, and you know when we're going to get to gas rationing? When we can't pay the bill for imported oil. We've been paying the bill for imported oil because the Farm Bill's producing enough food that we can export. If you look at the figures, it's over $20 billion we're earning by selling farm products, and we're paying an oil bill of 30. And when we can't pay, some president's going to have to lay it on the American people. But Frank, the big changes that I'm talking about that we could make, and that's when we'll begin to really move towards conservation, is to change our whole transportation priorities, to begin putting our money into mass transit systems, so that instead of my getting in my own car and struggling for 45 minutes through Washington traffic to get here and almost being late this morning, there's an easy, convenient way to get there, bringing the railroads back. The railroads are enormously efficient. Here are big projects that will help solve the energy crisis, that will conserve, that will provide more jobs and not less.
But when will the principal advocates of conservation, and by the way, I consider myself to be a conservation advocate too, but these points that are being made make something so clear. Again, you get back to natural gas being the most readily available fuel right now to help solve the present crunch, which is also the cleanest, Senator. And then we talk about coal and other alternatives, environmentally the least harmful. Now, when are we going to hear from the conservationists strong support for realistic pricing policies to get that natural gas that we've got out of the ground to help solve the current crunch? When I start hearing from the conservationists talk truth to the American consumer and say to the consumer, look, we're going to do everything we can. Let's apply every bit of capital investment we can into getting as much. Now, maybe there won't be quite enough, but let's get as much of these clean fuels as we can get. And when I hear that from the conservationists, support for programs that will bring the maximum, and really let's put all the capital and investment we can to get clean sources of energy. When I hear realistic talk like that, then I'll be willing to say to the people of my state in Oklahoma, for example, let's get tough on conservation and let's really look at these other alternatives. But I think we ought to hear both sides. And I hear from the conservationists just talk about limiting use. I hear too much from the producers just talk about increasing production. When are we going to hear from you as a conservationist some strong talk for incentives for more production of clean fuel?
Well, we agree with that, Dave. There's no question about that, but we just can't agree on the numbers. Now, I gave you $9. I gave you $9 and $1.30. You wouldn't accept that. I gave you the authority for it, the studies that have been made. Frank doesn't agree with it. I think the Senate Budget Committee did a study on it, came up and said at that figure that it would be a 14% return on the investment of the oil companies.
I'll make a deal with you, Senator. If you'll take that $1.30 as an average price, let's keep the old prices controlled, let the new prices go up to encourage exploration, We'll keep the average below the $1.30.
Listen, I'm a Republican. I'm a Republican. I believe in free enterprise. I believe in the profit system, but you know, it's got to be a fair profit. We've got to have gas. We've got to have oil at a reasonable price. That's what we're trying to achieve.
Yes, sir.
Isn't that correct?
That's absolutely
and we've
right.
got to have an incentive for your production. We want to do that, but let's have that reasonable price. Now, you said let's have a free market. We don't have a free market, Frank. I mean, you know, the OPEC cartel, they establish what the prices are. We don't have any free market, and let's not kid ourselves about it.
If we don't invest enough money in energy exploration, if we don't, you know what we're going to do in this country? When you talk about conservation, one of the things you're talking about is conserving jobs. We're going to have 19 or 20 or 25% unemployment in this country someday if we don't have energy sources to run the plants and the factories. And I think we ought to start making some hard choices. And this means that the people of this country are going to have to do without some of the things that they now have, not only from the sake of conservation, but they're going to have to do without some of the things they now have in order to get the money invested to explore new sources of energy, so we'll save their jobs in the long run. And I think that's of vital importance.
Governor, we're going to have to do something even sooner than that for unemployment, for jobs in the country. You say 25%. We have, in my state of Massachusetts, 13.9% already, some pockets of 17, 18%. It's 11.9% for all of New England. The cost of energy is just so high, it's prohibitive. You take our utilities, for example, up there.
But does the public really tie up the job problem with the energy
I
crisis?
think they do.
I just wonder whether they do. You look at these opinion polls, and jobs are not tied up with the energy problem.
I think they are. Certainly in New England they are, because they recognize that we've lost a lot of industry because of the high cost of a lot of jobs because of the high cost of energy. And you take utilities, for example. Now, this is a shocking fact. Our utility prices are so high that a good number of people now are paying more for their electric bills than they're paying for their mortgages. And our utility plants are burning residual oil. And it's the highest price oil. They're spending all that money. You know, we've got to get a point where utilities are no longer burning residual oil. And we have no gas, your cheap gas that you don't send us up there. We just can't burn that because we don't have it.
Solutions to the problem of how to get energy from the states that have it to states that don't have it but need it are hard to come by. Can higher prices solve the problem? Will deregulation really increase the supply of energy nationwide? What will happen over the long run if politicians make the popular decision to keep regulations on energy prices? Now, to challenge our speakers on energy policy, let's go to the experts in our audience.
And the question is this, that this is a discussion of the regional effects or schisms in energy in this country. Some people would translate that to a conflict between consumer and producer interests. Does it make sense rather to look at this as a conflict between the short run and the long run? That is, it is entirely possible in the short run to hold down the price of anything in this country. And we have, in the short run of 1954 and following, held down the price of natural gas. The consequence of that in the long run is that you have either shortages or higher priced alternatives, so that the protection of the consumer is not possible forever. That is, the protection from market forces. Does it make sense then to look at this really as a short run versus long run problem rather than as a producer-consumer or regional problem?
Senator Brooke, we'll go to you first.
I think it does. I think it ought to be a short run and a long-term problem. I just don't believe it's a question of consumer versus producer. I think it's been said, and I think we all agree that it is a national problem. I, for one, favor the decontrol of natural gas. I think you're absolutely right. We can't continue natural gas at the price we've had. We've had the the lid on it since 1938, and there is not the incentive for exploration of natural gas in the country, and we need it. We ourselves in New England have suffered because of this federal policy that has hurt us, and I'm sure it has hurt the rest of the country. So I'm in favor of that. I'm just not in favor of taking the lid off and not having some sealing at the initial stages until we know where we're going, and so that the consumer will not be hurt so dramatically initially after the decontrols go into effect. And that's why I favor the $1.30 MCF initially. But after that time, I think after 5 years, for example, I think we're just going to have to let it find its course.
Frank, sir?
I think we're making some progress on this issue, as you can see, with respect to the total question of price. Clear that we're going to have to create a long-range program so that investments can flow in the same direction, and we can't have the federal government looking at it every 18 months because we're just simply not going to get that long-range investment. I don't think the debate has at all been with respect to how soon, how fast, how high. The governors came up with a compromise that had a very, very slow impact. Senators Benson and Pearson submitted a bill to the Senate. At least it was agreed to be considered yesterday in a Senate vote. A lot of demagoguery against it. We've gone forward with phase-in programs that would have very slow impact. A lot of demagoguery against that. I think the only way what Senator Brooke just described is going to happen can be avoided, and I think it should be, because we're headed for disaster. Another embargo 2 years from now, if I reveal to you the numbers that I look at, would really be horrifying. The only way we can avoid this delay, which is be a very damaging delay, is for the American people to understand some of these truths and not let the candidate feel that what his staff man just told him before his next speech, it's popular to go out and bang the oil industry on the head or the administration on the head with respect to prices. So without knowing what you're talking about, Mr. Candidate, get up there and speak to that point. If the American people no longer are receptive to that kind of talk, it'll turn around. And that's where the issue, I think, has to be debated with the American people, because the political process won't do it.
Frank, that's what we're trying to do with these American Enterprise Institute's programs and public programs to get a dialogue going, get information out so there is better understanding. Let's go to the League of Women Voters.
Thank you, Mr. Laird, and I'm glad the panel finally got around to what we consider the real problem in the energy picture. The people do not know what the situation is. They are very confused about prices of natural gas, price of oil, the controlled price, the deregulated price, the phased price, or the phased decontrol. These are all very confusing to people, and they end up not really knowing which expert to believe, because you see, all of you are experts and many of you are saying somewhat different things. What really helps the person out there to understand is where it hits him in the pocketbook, and how is it going to affect me as far as my job and my lifestyle. And this is where we are trying to get information to people to understand this. The American Enterprise Institute television program is one way. The League of Women Voters tries to do it in a number of other ways. Now, my concern is, how is the federal government, how is, including the Congress and the administration, going to help people understand this? There are certain kinds of educational programs that are needed out there to help people really understand where it's at. We are going to have to change lifestyles. Energy is going to run out, as Mr. Udall has said. Someday there's going to be a day of reckoning. Technology isn't going to hold us forever. My question is, what is the best way to help citizens understand what the real problems are, and that we're all in this together, and to stop the sectional passions that seem to be aroused?
Stewart, do you want to comment on that?
Well, too much of the debate, I think we mentioned that and you touched on that point, too much of the discussion is irrelevant. The fact that the scapegoating of the oil industry, for example, that they're the cause of the problem, and that if they would just straighten up and fly right, it would go away. It appalls me, 2 years after the Arab embargo, that 2/3 of the American people, you see this on the polls, still don't believe there really is a serious long-term energy crisis. And I think we have to get that point across, and I believe the political dialogue has confused people. I frankly think the administration has confused people and the president. I think this simplistic approach that if we just let the price of everything rise, it'll sort itself out, and the new supplies of oil and gas will come flooding in. I think that's simplistic, and I think there's plenty of blame to go around. And I believe we're going to have Mel, a lot more forums like this. And I hope the campaign next year isn't all emotion, because the American people have got to understand this is probably the most serious problem, domestic problem, that we will have in the second half of the 20th century.
David, you?
Very quickly, I think that the people are wanting something from the leadership they're not getting. We had a road show in Oklahoma not too long ago of the show about Harry Truman that's being done right now. And some of those lines, he may have been right, he may have been wrong, but he's shot straight and he never was in doubt. And I tell you, I think that the people, here's what we need to do, the political leadership of this country. When someone gets up and says, I'm the friend of the consumer, and to go back to my candy bar example, which is real simple, we're going to help you because you all like candy bars, so we're going to set the price of candy bars at 2 cents. And we're going to ration them till they all run out, which will be next year. And every time somebody gets up and says, I'm the friend of all you candy bar lovers, that I'm going to set the price down at 2 cents, and doesn't tell them that next year it means they're not going to have any candy bars, I think those in political leadership ought to get up and say, you're a phony. You are a phony. You're not telling us the truth. We want prices that'll produce gas and oil and new forms of energy that'll give us jobs that we can keep and hold on to, and that in the long run is going to help us. And I think until we have those kinds of people that are going to shoot straight and say, let's make some tough choices, let's take some money out of some programs where we've got it now and get it over here into investing to find new and clean energy, we're not going to get it solved. It's leadership.
On behalf of Governor Boren, Senator Brooke, Frank Zarb, the Federal Energy Administrator, former Secretary of Interior Stewart Udall, we thank you for watching this program sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute. I'm sorry and apologize to some of you in our audience in the studio. We were unable to take all of your questions, but our hour has run out. Thank you very much.
This roundtable discussion on the problems involved in developing a national energy policy has brought you the opinions of 4 experts who hold differing views on what should be done to solve the many problems. It's the aim of AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, to illuminate the major issues of the day in the hope that by so doing, those in decision-making positions will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
Public Policy Forums is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a copy of this program, write to the American Enterprise Institute at 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.